Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over a game from round 2 of the 2014 Candidates Tournament. Our players, White's going to be commanded by Peter Svidler, and then Black's going to be played by Dmitry Andreikin. Again, two really talented players. White decides to start with pawn e4, pawn c5, so we do have the Sicilian defense, which is one of the more common openings that we'll see. Knight f3, knight c6, pawn d4 capture, so very common from both sides. Pawn to e5 is a little bit new. It's pretty common to see pawn to d6 early on, maybe later pushing forward the pawn to e5, so definitely not the most common opening. Knight to b5, pawn to d6. This does have a backwards pawn here on d6, very common for Black. It can be a weakness later on if he's not careful, but early on it's just not a big deal for Black because he has so many ways to defend this, but something to keep an eye on. Then pawn to c4. Now this is interesting because way more common. White's going to play bishop to c4. Both these pawns on d6 and e5 are kind of locked in, so this kind of frees up this long light square diagonal for this bishop. You obviously want to have both your minor pieces involved into the game, castle on one side of the board. The bishop can even come back here to b3, have a lot of havoc over here on the king side from Black, knowing good and well that he's probably not going to be castling on the queen side just because he's given up his c-pawn due to the Sicilian defense. But in the particular game, we have pawn here to c4, and we are kind of off to the races. Both sides are going to continue to develop. Black plays bishop to e7. We have knight to c3, pawn to e6. I really like this waiting move from Black, playing the bishop here to e7 before he forces this knight away. Now that the knight's on c3, this forces this knight to come back here to a3. Very awkwardly placed knight by White here. So a great move from Black. White really needs to now find a way to get this knight involved to the action because right now it's not doing a whole heck of a lot. Bishop here to e6, centralizing, also again developing all of his pieces. We have bishop here to e2, getting ready to castle on the king side, and then bishop here to g5. Now Black has a few options in this particular case. He can always play knight to d4. He does have a nice little outpost here. He could always bring his rook over here to c8. He does have a semi-open file. Rooks do extremely well in semi-open files. He could even just continue with his development. Knight here to f6, castle on the king side. In this particular defense, though, a lot of times players will try to play bishop here to g5, exchange off these dark square bishops, then bring their queen down here to g5 and try to launch an attack. And that's exactly what Black decided to do in this particular game. Good for White, though, is he actually played this pretty smart in this exchange, and he didn't take right away. Instead, he played knight to c2, and then after the exchange, the rook takes on c1, and now the queen comes down here to g5. And think about this, how different it is. Instead of the bishop taking on g5 and the queen taking on g5, all of a sudden White does not have his knight on c2, does not have his rook over here on c1. All of a sudden White is kind of down in the moves, but because he kind of waited, and you should always do this in your own games, even if you want to exchange, White could sit here and say, I definitely want to give up my dark square bishop. That doesn't mean you should go ahead and take it right away. See if you can get a few extra moves, especially if you know your opponent wants to exchange and then get his queen involved into the game. And that's exactly what Peter Svidler did. He played knight here to c2, and then after the exchange, he has a few extra moves on the board. Now he decides to go ahead and castle on the king side. Definitely want to have king side safety. And now the rook's going to swing over here to d8. As we talked about, Black has this backward pawn here on d6 he has to be worried about. The bishop, the dark square bishop, was kind of holding on to it, and his queen was kind of holding on to it. Now that both of those are no longer holding on to it, definitely needs to make sure that he is protecting it, and so he brings his rook over here to d8. Next move from White does have a lot of options. Played pawn here to b4. Now his opponent Dmitry after the game said he really didn't like this move. Later on, Svidler would go on to criticize some of Dmitry's moves as well, which we'll talk about later in the game. But if I kind of look at the board, this is not a bad move for White at all. I actually think this is pretty good. I think it's doing exactly what he needs to do, putting a lot of pressure on this queen side. So I don't really know where he wanted him to go. Maybe knight to d5 right away and just not mess with it. Potentially play pawn here to b3 if you wanted to maybe have a stronger pawn chain, but b4 is still pretty strong. There's no great attack that black can really do here. And now we have knight to f6. Again, definitely want to make sure that there is a castle on the king side. Don't want to leave your king exposed too much. Then we have queen here to d3, and we have castling on the king side. The rook's going to swing over here to d1, putting more pressure on this pawn on d6. Black decides to go ahead and swing his rook over. He recognizes there's too much pressure on here, so he's going to just swing his rook over here to c8, not too worried about it. Now the knight's going to swing in here to a d5. This is another one of those moves that Dmitry kind of looked at and said, not too sure if this is the best move out there. But all in all, again, I think it was pretty good. Black now played pawn to b5, and Svidler said this is one of the worst moves that black could have played in this position. Instead, he likes the rook swinging over here to d8. Now that it's kind of clogged up, getting his other rook involved into the game, protecting again this backward pawns here on d6 makes a little bit more sense. But in the game, again, we have pawn here to b5, and then the queen's going to swing over here to g3. Now, I really thought that we were going to see the knight take here on f6, and then after we have a take here, then play would continue. But instead, we see a nice little move from Peter Svidler, and he plays queen here to g3, and then after the queen takes, the knight now takes, and only now takes on f6, because it forces his opponent to have doubled pawns here, and also has an opening for white to attack. And so we see the double pawns right here, and then white's going to take back here. This is a little bit better for white. He doesn't have a isolated pawn like black does over here. Again, he does have doubled pawns, but again, they're all sort of connected. This is definitely going to be an easier in-game for white to play, especially since there's these rooks. They can easily get over here. It's going to be very difficult for black to hold on to it if he doesn't play correctly. Now, black's going to take with his pawn here on c4. And then, in my opinion, one of the best moves in the game, you can see there's a lot of tension on this pawn on c4. But white plays pawn here to f4. What's interesting about this is it may go unnoticed if you're just going through the game, but it's these type of moves that incrementally get you an advantage in a game. If we look at this position right here, again, black has taken material here on c4, and all of a sudden white needs to figure out what he wants to do. He could take here on d6. Again, he just gave up material, so he could take with his rook. But then after the rook comes to d8, all of a sudden there's an exchange. Black controls this long file right here. He does have some pretty active pieces. He has a nice little outpost he can come to with his knight. It's not really clear how white's going to have the advantage. This is pretty much equal, in my opinion, if we look at both sides of the board. Instead, he recognizes that he's down a pawn to material after that exchange. But instead of just trying to figure out how he can take this right away, he pushes forward with pawn to f4. He recognizes that he can next play pawn to f5, forcing this bishop away. That will open up the door for the bishop or the pawn here on c4 to be taken. But if the pawn takes on f4, then white can respond by taking back. White no longer has double pawns. Black not only has doubled pawns, but they're now isolated, and he has no protection from pawns on either side of the board. So all in all, this is going to be very, very good for Peter Svidler. Dmitry decides to go ahead and defend with pawn to f5. This is going to be completely okay for white. He's now going to take, and now after the bishop takes, the knight's now going to swing over here to e3. Very, very nice square, not only attacking the bishop, but also attacking the pawn here on c4. Black still has a pretty fighting chance in this game. He has to play correct. Instead of playing correct, though, he plays one of the worst moves he could have, and he plays bishop here to d3, giving up somewhat of the advantage that he potentially may have had. We could have continued with bishop to e4, and then after the knight takes, again, taking that material back on the board. Then we see another knight take. Now the knight can take here on d6. And if we look at it, black still has a fairly good game. We could see the rook come back here to c5, attacking material. White's going to be able to stabilize on the material, and then all of a sudden he should have a pretty good endgame, since his opponent does have these isolated pawns over here. Although this one is a pass pawn on a6, white still probably has the advantage. If we come back in the game, though, instead of playing bishop there to e4, Black decided to play bishop here to d3, and Peter Svidler saw this and quickly took advantage. He played bishop takes on d3. After the pawn takes on d3, the knight to f5, and this move right here is just a dagger in the position. It really shows how poorly constructed Black's pieces are set up towards the end of the game, and now it's just a matter of execution, getting his pieces exactly where they need to be for the final blow. So there's no real great square that Black can go to. He does decide to push forward with pawn to e4. One last attempt to kind of push forward with his pawns. White now responds with taking here on d6, attacking the rook here on c8. Again, Black decides to push forward with his pawn here on e3. Pretty much giving up this rook here on c8. Now, if we kind of look at different options, if Black decided to instead play rook here to c7, again, that's still not going to be that great. We can now have just the knight take here on e4 if we want to. White's just going to continue to gobble up material. He's going to be up too many pawns in this game for Black to really do too much on the board. If Black decides to play rook anywhere else, let's say rook here to b8, then White can go ahead and just come in, swoop in, take this knight here on c6, and again, Black's just going to be down too much material. So he didn't like any of those options, which makes sense. None of them are really good. He plays pawn here to e4, saying, hey, I'm going to give up material. He continues to push forward with e3. I'm going to give up material, and I'm just going to continue to push forward, and hopefully I can come up with something. Plays the rook, taking hit, the knight here on c6, and then we see pawn here to e2. Again, a phenomenal move from White here. He plays rook to c1. Again, one of these pawns is going to promote, but really can't do too much. We now see the pawn take here. The rook's going to capture. Again, it really didn't matter if he turned it into a rook or a queen. It was going to be captured right away. Decided to turn it into a rook. After it captures, this pawn can't really go anywhere. The rook can capture this knight, but now all of a sudden we see White is up 2 pawns of material going into the endgame. There's just no way for Black to overcome that. And so in this particular case, Dmitry decided to go ahead and resign. So great game by Peter Svidler. Again, exceptionally great to see him playing at such a high level, especially in round 2. Anytime you're playing with the white pieces, you want to come out with a draw or specifically a win. If you can get a win under your belt this early on, this gives you a lot of confidence going into the later rounds. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this game. Shows you some of the little subtleties in chess that actually end up giving you wins at this high level format. I'll be again doing commentary for each round. I'll be picking a game that I think you guys will enjoy. If you haven't already, there'll be a link in the description for the new Facebook page. Make sure you check that out and like it. You can also make sure that you get notifications. We are always posting content to that, so make sure there's a button next to the like button. Make sure that you have checked that. See you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.